The dying choir. The war room was silent in a way that felt like a funeral. 17 species sat around the great circular table, and not one of them made a sound. The holographic map floating above the center of the room told the story better than any words could. Red. Most of it was red now. 43 worlds had fallen to the Vecthari Dominion in 11 years, and the red was still spreading, slow and steady, like blood soaking through cloth. Admiral Sereth of the Lissari stood at the head of the table. He was tall, blue-skinned, with 4 arms that he usually held with great dignity. Right now, 2 of those arms were pressed flat on the table, and the other 2 hung at his sides like broken wings. He looked old. He looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "The projections are final," he said. His voice was low and even. "Our War Council has run the numbers 47 times. The conclusion is the same every time. We cannot win this war." No one argued. That was perhaps the worst part. 11 years ago, someone would have shouted. Someone would have stood up and slammed a fist on the table and called it defeatist talk. But 11 years of watching the red spread across the map had taken that fire out of everyone in the room. The Vecthari Dominion was not like any enemy the Covenant had faced before. They were not simply powerful. They were precise. They were a machine-organic hybrid civilization, meaning their minds were part biological and part computational, and they had turned warfare into a science so exact that it was almost beautiful. If you could ignore the death, their doctrine was built on a single principle: probability. Before every battle, their systems calculated the odds of success. If the odds fell below 12%, they did not fight. They simply waited, repositioned, and found a better angle. They never wasted soldiers. They never made emotional decisions. They never threw good resources after bad. They won because they were never wrong about when to fight and when to hold back. And they had studied the Covenant well. They knew that the Lissari retreated when their losses crossed 30%. They knew the Chorathi would never attack without clear air superiority. They knew the Muvan refused to fight in close quarters. They had mapped every species in the Covenant, charted their limits, learned their breaking points, and designed every single battle around those known boundaries. It was not war. It was an equation. And the Covenant kept losing, because it kept behaving exactly as predicted. Sereth pulled up the casualty reports and said nothing. The numbers spoke. 4 billion dead across Covenant worlds, 18 fleet divisions destroyed, 6 more down to skeleton crews. The industrial planets in the Eastern Reach were already rationing fuel. "Surrender protocols are being drafted," said a Muvan delegate from the far end of the table. She said it quietly, as if hoping no one would hear. "It is not cowardice. It is mathematics." A few heads nodded slowly. A few more stared at the map. The room felt like it was sinking. It was then that a small voice came from near the back. "What about the humans?" Everyone turned. The speaker was a junior Covenant diplomat named Korshan, a young Thalari with pale feathers and wide eyes. She looked like she immediately regretted speaking. But the words were out, and they floated there in the silence like something strange that had crawled in from outside. Admiral Sereth blinked. He turned toward her slowly. "I beg your pardon?" Korshan straightened. Her feathers ruffled slightly. "The humans. They joined the Covenant 6 years ago. They have a military. They volunteered to contribute forces during the initial treaty talks. We never really gave them a significant role in the campaign because their fleet is small and their technology is behind ours by at least 2 generations. But they have been asking to be included." She paused. "I am only asking. What about them?" The reaction around the table was almost universal. A few people looked confused. A Karathi general let out a low sound that was the equivalent of a polite laugh. An older Lissari delegate shook his head slowly, as though a child had asked a silly question. "The humans," said the Chorathi general, "have 11 warships in our theater of operations. 11. We have lost more ships than that in a single afternoon. Their soldiers are fragile," said another delegate. "No natural armor, no redundant organs. They feel pain acutely, and they tire quickly. Their biology is not suited for extended conflict." Their home system is one planet and 2 colonies, said another. They are barely spacefaring. Korshan nodded. She had expected all of this. I know, she said. I simply thought that since every other option has been exhausted, perhaps we should look at the file. There was a pause. What file? Asked Sarith. The one our intelligence division compiled when the humans first applied for Covenant membership, she said. The historical record. Their own history of warfare. The silence shifted. It was a different kind of quiet now. Curious rather than hopeless. Sarith looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded to the data officer at the edge of the room. Pull it up. The officer found the file and projected it onto the secondary screens around the room. It was a long document. Very long. The summary alone ran to several hundred pages. The room began to read. At first there were small sounds of confusion, then frowns, then something harder to name. The Charathi general leaned forward in his seat. The Muvan delegate stopped looking at the floor. An old Lasari counselor, who had been silent for the entire session, slowly took off his reading spectacles, cleaned them carefully, and put them back on, as if he needed to make sure he was seeing correctly. They read about trenches dug into frozen mud, while men died by the thousands for a single field. They read about sieges that lasted years, where people ate rats and boiled leather and kept fighting. They read about soldiers who charged into certain death on direct orders and somehow came out the other side. They read about wars that lasted 100 years. Wars that started, stopped, started again, mutated into new shapes, spread across entire continents, burned everything, and were then followed by the survivors immediately beginning to rebuild. They read about a species that had, at one point or another, used disease, weather, starvation, deception, animals, fire, poison, religion, music, economics, and sheer screaming stubbornness as weapons of war. A species that had never once, in its entire recorded history, found a tactic too strange to try. They read for nearly 40 minutes without anyone speaking. It was the Korathi general who broke the silence. His voice was odd. Careful. These conflicts, he said slowly. They fought them against each other? Yes, said Korshan. For thousands of years? Yes. He was quiet for another moment. And they survived? They did. The general sat back in his chair and said nothing else. Admiral Sarith stood at the head of the table and looked at the map. The red was still there, still spreading. The surrender protocols were still waiting in a folder on the data officer's screen. The war was still lost by every calculation they had. He breathed in slowly. Contact the humans, he said. Tell their military leadership we are requesting their presence at this council. Immediately. The message was sent. The room waited. Some of them expected the reply to take days. The humans were far from the station, and their communication systems were not as fast as the Covenant's standard relays. The reply came in 47 minutes. It was short. It said, "We are already on our way." Sarith read it twice. Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at the red map again. He did not feel hope exactly. Hope was perhaps too strong a word. But something had shifted in the room. Something small and stubborn had crept in under the door. He thought about what he had read in that file. 1,000 years of war, a species that should have destroyed itself 10 times over, and somehow kept finding new reasons to get back up. He thought about the Vekthari's perfect equations. He wondered, for the first time in a very long while, if equations could account for something like that. The ones who don't know when to quit. She did not look like someone who was going to save the galaxy. Fleet Admiral Yara Ose was a short woman with dark brown skin, close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of eyes that made people feel she had already figured out what they were going to say before they opened their mouths. She wore a standard-issue human military uniform, with no decorations on it except her rank insignia, and she carried nothing into the War Council chamber except a data pad and a plain metal cup of coffee. She had arrived on the UNSS Defiance, humanity's flagship, which was itself a perfectly functional but unremarkable vessel by Covenant standards. It was older than most of the scout ships in the Lasari fleet. It had been repaired so many times that parts of its hull were 3 different shades of gray. The crew kept it running with equal parts engineering skill and what could only be described as optimism. The council chamber was full when she walked in. Every species had sent their senior military representatives, and they all watched her cross the room with the kind of polite curiosity usually reserved for something mildly interesting in a zoo. Admiral Sareth greeted her formally and gestured to the chair at the table. She sat down, took a sip of coffee, and looked at the map. 11 years, she said, more to herself than the room. We have prepared a full briefing, said Sareth. Our strategic overview, current front positions, casualty reports, resource estimates. I've read them, she said. All of them. During the transit here. She set the data pad on the table. You didn't ask me here for a briefing. You asked me here because you've run out of ideas and you want to know if we have any. The room was quiet. Sareth inclined his head. That is accurate. Good, said Osei. I prefer honest rooms. She looked around the table slowly, meeting eyes where she could. So, you've been losing because the Vekthari can predict everything you do. They've studied your species, learned your limits, built their battle plans around your behavior. That's the problem. In simplified terms, yes, said a Charathi general. Simplified terms are usually the right ones, she said. She pulled up something on the datapad and slid it toward the center of the table so the holographic display could project it. It was a document. Long, dense, full of data, and small text. This is our counter-doctrine. Human military strategy for this war. I want you to read the summary. They read it. And within 3 minutes, the room was visibly uncomfortable. One Lasari general stopped reading and looked up with an expression of genuine distress. A move-in delegate covered the lower half of her face with one hand. A Thalari counselor pushed the display slightly away from himself as though it had said something rude. This is. The Chorathi general searched for the right word. This is not warfare. It's warfare, said Osei calmly. It's just not the kind you're used to. You are proposing to use tactics that violate every established principle of rational military engagement, said the Lasari general. Deliberate self-damage to disguise unit strength. Sustained operations in environments rated as unsurvivable. Extended infiltration without supply lines. Psychological manipulation of enemy command units. These methods are effective, said Osei. Barbaric, said the Lasari general. Also effective, said Osei. She leaned forward slightly and spoke clearly, because she wanted this understood. The Vekthari win because they can predict what you will do. They know you retreat at 30% losses. They know you don't attack without air cover. They know your supply chains, your communication habits, your preferred engagement ranges. They have built a perfect model of every species at this table. She paused. They don't have one for us. You have not fought them, said the Chorathi general. No, she agreed. And that is the most valuable thing we have right now. We are unknown. To their systems, we are noise. We don't follow the patterns they expect, because the patterns we follow are ones they have never seen and cannot model. She sat back. And I intend to make it worse. Worse, repeated a Move-in delegate flatly. Humanity has a long history of warfare, said Osei. A very long one. We have fought in deserts and underwater and underground, and in cities and in forests at night, in the rain with no supplies and no communication, and no clear objective. And we have found ways to win, anyway. We have used tactics that, if I describe them to you in full, would make most of this room physically ill. She said this without pride and without apology. It was simply a fact. We don't have those limits because we burned through them centuries ago fighting each other. We know what the bottom of the barrel looks like. We've lived there. An ambassador near the far end of the table stood up. He was Yvari, a species known for their strict codes of honorable combat. His voice was tight. I will not sit here and endorse a war strategy built on deception and self-destruction. This is not how civilized beings wage war. With respect, said Osei, looking at him steadily. The civilized approach has lost you 43 worlds. The Yvari ambassador sat back down. 2 other delegates exchanged glances. One of them quietly left the room. Osei watched them go and said nothing. She pulled up one more display. It was a chart the Vekthari's own probability models, captured from a disabled enemy command ship 3 years ago. Columns of numbers, equations, projections. Every Covenant species had a row. Their behaviors, their limits, their response patterns, all laid out in the cold language of mathematics. "Look at the bottom," she said. The room looked. At the very bottom of the chart, where humanity's row should have been, there was a single notation. It was short. It had been entered by a Vekthari analyst some years ago, when the Dominion had first taken note of humanity's Covenant membership. It read, "Insufficient data. Behavioral parameters, undefined. Engagement not recommended, until further modeling complete." The room was very still. "They don't know what we'll do," said Osei quietly. "They haven't been able to model us. They've been putting off any serious engagement with human forces because they don't want to fight something they can't predict. That caution is a window, and I want to throw a very large rock through it." She stood up and walked to the holographic map. She pointed to 3 separate locations: the Korath Nebula, the frozen world of Ishval, 9, and a deep point behind the Vekthari's main supply corridor. "We're not going to fight their war," she said. "We're going to make them fight ours." 3 simultaneous operations, each one designed to produce outcomes their systems cannot anticipate. No clean lines, no predictable escalation, no rational behavior curves. She looked at the map. "We're going to be everything they can't calculate." Sareth watched her from his seat. He had commanded fleets for 30 years. He had seen many officers present plans in that room. He had seen confidence before, and he had seen delusion, and he had learned to tell them apart. He studied Osei carefully. She was not pretending. She was not performing for the room. She was simply laying out what she intended to do, the way a craftsperson lays out their tools before starting a job. "If we grant you operational command of this phase," he said slowly, "and it fails, then you're no worse off than you are right now," she said. "You were already drafting surrender protocols when I walked in." He could not argue with that. The vote was not unanimous. 3 species abstained. 1 formally registered a complaint. But the result was what it was. And when the session ended, Osei walked out of the chamber with operational command of the most critical phase of a war that had been declared unwinnable. Her aide fell into step beside her in the corridor. "How are you feeling, Admiral?" he asked. She took a long sip from her metal cup. The coffee had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "Tell the Defiance crew to get some sleep," she said. "We have a lot of work to do." Behind her, through the viewport at the end of the corridor, the stars were cold and very far away. And somewhere beyond them, the Vekthari Dominion was running its perfect equations, certain of what would happen next. It had never once considered that the answer might be something it could not calculate. Shattering the board, the Vekthari battle commander Sorveth had never encountered an error in his probability systems before. Not a real one. Not the kind that sat in the middle of the screen and refused to resolve itself, no matter how many times the data was refreshed. He stared at it now, 4 hours into the engagement at the Korath Nebula, and he felt something that his machine-organic mind was not fully equipped to process. It took him several minutes to identify the feeling. It was confusion. The human ships should have retreated by now. The calculations were clear. 3 of their vessels had sustained damage that put them at less than 40% combat effectiveness. Every known species in the Covenant began withdrawal procedures at that threshold. It was not courage or cowardice, it was simply rational. A damaged ship was a liability. You pulled it back, repaired it, and brought it forward again when it could contribute meaningfully. The human ships were not pulling back. They were accelerating. The UNSS Bradbury, which had taken a direct hit to its forward section and was venting atmosphere from 2 decks, was pushing its engines to full power and driving straight into the center of the Vekthari formation. It had stopped firing its main weapons. It had locked its collision course and was broadcasting nothing but a steady, wordless signal on all frequencies. Sorveth recalculated. He recalculated again. His systems insisted this was irrational behavior. His systems did not know what to do with irrational behavior. The Bradbury hit the Vecthari carrier Dominant Truth at full speed. The explosion took out the carrier, 2 escort vessels, and knocked the shields off a third ship. In the seconds that followed, 2 other human ships that had been hanging back surged into the gap the explosion had opened, firing everything they had at close range into the unshielded flanks of the formation. The Vecthari flank collapsed. It had not been reinforced because the calculations had said it did not need to be. Damaged human ships retreated. That was the model. That was what always happened. Sorveth stared at the gap in his formation where an entire flank had just ceased to exist. Then he began the slow, deeply uncomfortable process of issuing orders he had never planned to give. Far away from the burning nebula, on the frozen surface of Ishval 9, a different kind of war was being fought. There were no clean lines on Ishval 9. No front. No rear. The ice caves beneath the surface ran for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, a maze that the planet's original settlers had mapped over decades of careful exploration. The Vecthari ground force of 9,000 soldiers had arrived, expecting a standard planetary pacification. They found an empty surface. Then, they found the caves. Then, the caves started killing them. Lieutenant Priya Shen had 312 soldiers under her command and no expectation of reinforcement for at least 4 months. What she had was those maps, 6 months of stored rations, enough explosives to be creative, and a very thorough understanding of how desperate people think when they are cold and frightened and cannot find their enemy. She did not fight battles. She fought moments. A quick ambush at a cave junction 8 Vecthari down, her people gone into the dark before the enemy could respond. A sealed tunnel that looked empty, but had a pressure trigger buried 2 meters inside the entrance. A cache of food and equipment left in an obvious location, just damaged enough to be usable, laced with a slow-acting compound that caused disorientation for 3 days. She let the Vecthari find one of her soldiers' bodies once. Just one. She made sure it was carrying fake orders, detailing a defensive position in the eastern caves. The Vecthari committed 2,000 soldiers to sweep that direction. The sweep took 3 weeks and found nothing. When those soldiers returned, they were exhausted, and their equipment had been operating in freezing conditions for too long. She broadcast fake radio chatter in Covenant standard frequencies, distress calls, fake supply requests, invented communications between units that did not exist. The Vecthari spent considerable processing power trying to triangulate signals that led nowhere. 9,000 soldiers were pinned on a frozen rock by 312. The Vecthari command kept sending reinforcements because they could not understand why pacification was taking so long. Each new group of soldiers arrived and disappeared into the same grinding, invisible war. The planet was supposed to be a minor strategic point. It had become a drain that pulled enemy resources away from 3 other fronts. An observer from the Chorathi military watched a summary of Ishval 9's progress from the Covenant command station and said nothing for a very long time. Then he turned to his aide and said, quietly, "I don't think they're trying to win down there. I think they're trying to be expensive." His aide considered this. "Is there a difference?" The Chorathi general thought about it. "For us, yes. For humans, I am beginning to think no." The third operation had no explosions, no ambushes, no soldiers visible anywhere at all. It had 5 people, a stolen Vecthari maintenance access code, and a plan that a Lasari logistics expert had called too petty to work when it was briefed to the Covenant Council. The logistics expert was wrong. Chief Warrant Officer James Adua and his 4-person team had spent 11 weeks inserting themselves into the Vecthari supply network as a logistics audit unit. They had moved quietly through 3 Dominion-controlled systems using falsified credentials that a human intelligence team had spent 8 months building. They reached the Dominion's primary logistics hub, not a military installation, but a massive data coordination center that managed supply deliveries across a third of the Dominion's active fronts. They did not blow it up. They did not sabotage any hardware. They sat in a maintenance corridor for 6 days and made very small, very careful changes to the database. Wrong ammunition types routed to 4 separate fleet groups. Fuel mixture ratios adjusted by small amounts, not enough to show up immediately in testing, but enough to cause efficiency losses over weeks of operation. Coordinate data for a supply convoy shifted by a fraction of a degree, enough to send it 40,000 kilometers off course. Medical supply shipments redirected to a depot that had been destroyed 2 months ago. None of it was obvious. None of it screamed sabotage. It looked like administrative errors, the kind that accumulated in large, complex systems under the pressure of an active war. The Dominion's own quality control processes flagged some of the inconsistencies, but resolved them as data noise. For 6 weeks, the Vekthari's eastern supply network quietly fell apart. Soldiers ran short of the right ammunition. Ships ran inefficiently. A convoy was lost. Medical shortages appeared in 3 forward units. When Adua's team extracted, they left nothing behind. No fingerprints. No evidence. Just a system that was quietly and stubbornly not working as well as it used to. Back at the Covenant command station, the reports from all 3 operations came in over the course of a week. Admiral Sareth read each one carefully. He had seen many battle reports in his career. He had never read anything quite like these. A Lissari intelligence officer approached him as he finished the last one. The Vekthari have been in communication with their high command more frequently than usual, the officer said. We've intercepted fragments. Their probability systems are returning anomalous results across all 3 theaters. They're having difficulty modeling the next phase of human operations. Sareth looked at the reports one more time. Good, he said. In a corridor nearby, a young Thalari aide overheard a human lieutenant explaining HFY 9 to a colleague. She stopped and listened without meaning to. How do your soldiers keep going down there? The aide asked, unable to stop herself. The cold, the isolation, the odds. How do they maintain the will to fight? The lieutenant looked at her. He was young, not much older than she was. He scratched the back of his neck and thought about it like she had asked him something genuinely puzzling. I don't think they think about the odds much, he said. I think they think about the next hour. And then the hour after that. She stared at him. That's it? She said. Mostly, he said, and walked away. She stood there for a moment, in the corridor, and thought about the Vekthari's perfect models and their perfect equations. She thought about the humans, dividing an impossible thing into small enough pieces that it stopped looking impossible. Somewhere far away, in the cold heart of the Vekthari Dominion, a system that had never returned an error in 11 years of continuous operation, sat in silence for 0.3 seconds before issuing a single-word status flag across 17 active battle theaters. The word was unknown. It was the first time it had ever used that word. It would not be the last. The weight of the method. The list was 41 pages long. Admiral Osei read it every time a new one arrived. She sat alone in her quarters on the Defiance, with the light turned low and the ship quiet around her, and she read every name. It took time. She did not rush it. Other officers had told her, gently, that it was not necessary, that she had a war to run, that there were more efficient ways to honor the dead than spending an hour in the dark reading a document that grew longer every week. She had thanked them for the advice and continued doing it anyway. The Bradbury crew, the soldiers from HFY 9's 2nd Platoon, who had been caught in a tunnel collapse during their 14th ambush. A technical team that had been extracted from Vekthari space, but did not all survive the extraction. A pilot whose fighter had been hit at Korath while covering a damaged carrier's retreat. Young people. Experienced people. People with families somewhere. People who had known the odds and done it anyway. She read their names, and then she went back to work. That was all she could give them. She went back to work. The Covenant had started to notice that humans mourned differently from everyone else. It was not that other species did not feel loss. They did. The Lissari held quiet, formal ceremonies. The Karathi had specific mourning rituals that lasted several days. The Muvin processed grief inwardly and communally over long periods. All of it was real. All of it mattered. But the humans were loud about it. They gathered in groups and told stories about the people who had died, sometimes funny stories that made people laugh, which confused Covenant observers greatly. They played music. Sometimes they were angry openly, visibly angry, in a way that other species found uncomfortable to witness. And then, in the same breath, They turned back to their stations and kept working. The grief and the momentum existed in the same person at the same time, and no one seemed to find that strange. A young Thelari officer named Kor Shan, who had followed the human operations closely since she first raised the question in the War Council, watched a small group of human soldiers hold an informal memorial in one of the Defiance's cargo bays. They had set up a few lights. Someone was playing a stringed instrument. Others were standing together, some with cups in their hands, talking quietly or not talking at all. One woman was crying without any apparent embarrassment about it. Korshan stood at the edge of the bay and felt something she struggled to name. She thought these people should look broken. By the numbers, by any reasonable measure, they should look like people who were losing. Instead, they looked like people who were choosing to feel something terrible fully, right now, and then would finish feeling it when they were done, and do something about it. She had not expected that to be frightening, but it was. The fractures in the Covenant Council appeared around the same time the victories started becoming real. It was the boarding actions that caused the most argument. Human infantry had begun conducting close-quarters assaults on Vekthari vessels, rather than destroying them outright. It was costly. Ship-to-ship boarding was ugly, dangerous work that most species had long abandoned in favor of long-range weapons. The casualty rate was high, but it produced results: intact Vekthari ships that could be studied, data cores that could be extracted, systems that could be turned over to Covenant intelligence for analysis. A Yivari ambassador stood before the council and called it indefensible. "You are sending soldiers to die in corridors when you could simply destroy the ships from a safe distance," he said. "You are treating your own people as expendable tools." Osei was present at the session. She had been asked to attend and give a progress report. She sat and listened to the full speech. When the ambassador finished, she stood up. "We're getting more intelligence from those captured ships than we've collected in 3 years of the war," she said. "That intelligence is directly contributing to better targeting, better resource allocation, and lower losses overall. But the boarding teams know what they signed up for," she said. Her voice was even. "Every one of them was briefed. Every one of them volunteered for the unit. I did not draft them. I did not deceive them." She paused. "I will not pretend the cost is small. It isn't. But the people paying it chose to pay it." "That doesn't make it right," said the ambassador. "No," she agreed. "But it makes it theirs." The ambassador stared at her. He was a good person. He genuinely believed what he was saying. She did not disrespect him for it. "Are we winning?" she asked the room. No one answered. "Then the debate can continue," she said, and sat back down. Elsewhere, in the cold interior of a Vekthari command installation, a report was being delivered that no Dominion analyst had ever expected to write. The High Command had ordered a full study of humanity, every scrap of information available, their history, their biology, their social structure, their military record. A senior strategist named Vel Khan had been assigned to compile and interpret it. He spent 3 weeks doing nothing else. His report was 40 pages. His summary was 1 paragraph. He read it aloud to the High Command. "The humans are not fighting irrationally," he said. "They are operating on a form of rationality that is foreign to our modeling systems. Their tolerance for loss is not absence of calculation, it is a different calculation. They measure acceptable cost, not against survival probability, but against something else. Something we do not have a precise term for." He paused. "For lack of a better word, I am calling it commitment. They have decided what this war is worth to them, and that value is very high. High enough to include outcomes that our models classify as defeat." The High Command was quiet. "Our models assume that all rational beings share a similar definition of what constitutes an unacceptable cost," Velkan continued. "The humans do not share that definition. They were forged in an environment that repeatedly pushed them to the absolute limit of survival, and they developed a threshold for acceptable loss that is, by our standards, extreme. They are not being reckless. They are being themselves." He set the report down. "We cannot predict them because we do not think like them, and we cannot learn to think like them without becoming something we are not." One of the High Command members spoke. "Then what do you recommend?" Velkan was quiet for a moment. He was a scientist. He had spent his career building models and trusting them. He did not enjoy what he was about to say. "I recommend," he said carefully, "that we consider the possibility that this is a war we should find a different way to end." That same evening, the Vekthari sent a message. It did not go through Covenant diplomatic channels. It did not go to Admiral Sereth, or to the Council, or to any official representative of the Covenant Alliance. It came directly to the UNSS Defiance, addressed to Admiral Yara Osei by name. It was very short. It said, "We would like to speak with you, without the others, at a place of mutual choosing. We believe there is a conversation that needs to happen, and we believe you are the one it needs to happen with." Osei read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk next to the latest casualty list, which she had not yet finished reading. She sat there for a while in the quiet of her quarters, her coffee cold in its cup, the stars moving slowly past the small viewport beside her desk. She thought about the 41 pages of names. She thought about the Vekthari strategist, whoever had written that message, sitting somewhere in the dark trying to solve a problem they could not put numbers to. She thought about the fact that someone on the other side had finally decided to say something, and what that meant, and what it would cost, and what it might save. She picked up the message and read it one more time. Then she called her aide and told him she needed a neutral location mapped within 48 hours. The door to something was opening. She did not know yet what was on the other side of it, but she had learned, a long time ago, that the only way to find out what was on the other side of a door was to walk through it. She had never been afraid of doors. The rule they never expected. The neutral station was small and old, and sat at the very edge of Dominion territory like something that had been forgotten there. It had been a research outpost once, abandoned 40 years ago, when the project it supported ran out of funding. No one owned it now. No flags flew on it. It drifted in the dark between two star systems, cold and quiet, and that made it exactly right for what was about to happen. Osei arrived with 2 aides and no weapons. She had thought carefully about that choice. The Vekthari could have killed her if they wanted to. They had not chosen to, which meant they had something they valued more than her death. She did not need a weapon for a conversation. She had come to have a conversation. The Vekthari executor arrived with a single attendant. His name, as best as it could be translated, was something close to absolute clarity of purpose. He was tall and still, with a body that was part organic and part precision-engineered machine, silver and gray, and very controlled in every movement. His eyes were compound, like deep glass, and they tracked everything in the room simultaneously. He had been directing the Dominion's war effort from the beginning. He had overseen the fall of 43 worlds, with the same steady efficiency he applied to everything else. He sat across from her at the single table in the middle of the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he did. "You have been difficult to model," he said. His voice was flat and precise, translated by the room's system. "In 11 years of this war, we have never encountered a variable we could not, eventually, reduce to predictable parameters. You have remained outside that process." "I know," said Osei. "It is not a compliment," he said. "I didn't take it as one," she replied. He placed both hands flat on the table. "We have run 10,000 simulations of this war, from its current position to its conclusion. The models account for your current operational tempo, your resource base, your projected fleet growth, your industrial output, your alliance stability. In every simulation, every one your civilization reaches a point of exhaustion within 40 years. Biology is finite. Resources are finite. Will is finite." He looked at her steadily. "We are prepared to wait. We have waited before. We will outlast you." Osei nodded slowly. "That's probably true," she said. He had not expected her to agree. A small thing in his expression shifted. "You concede the point." "I concede the math," she said. "I'm not disagreeing with your numbers." She reached into the document bag beside her chair and removed a single printed page. She placed it on the table and turned it to face him. "Look at the bottom 3 lines," she said. He looked. The page was a chart. Population growth, industrial expansion, military production capacity. All of it projected forward, 40 years. The bottom 3 lines showed where those numbers landed at the end of that period, assuming the war continued and humanity kept building at its current rate. The executor studied the chart. He was very still. His compound eyes moved across the numbers slowly. Then they moved across them again. "This is your projection," he said. "It's conservative," she said. "Our economists think it undersells us. We've always been better at growing under pressure than we are in peacetime. Something about necessity." She folded her hands on the table. "Here's what your models missed. You assume that we fight wars the way your other enemies fight wars, spending down our resources and our people until we can't continue. You modeled us as a civilization that consumes itself in conflict." She paused. "We don't work that way. We've fought wars that lasted 100 years while simultaneously building universities, developing new medicines, expanding into new territories, having children, writing books, and laying the foundations for the next century. We don't stop doing those things because there's a war. We do them harder." The executor said nothing. "Your 40-year timeline is real," she said. "But you modeled humanity at 40 years of war. What you actually have is 40 years of humanity under pressure, which is a completely different thing." She tapped the bottom of the chart. "That is what you will face if this war continues. Not an exhausted species crawling toward a finish line. A species that has spent 40 years building while fighting. And that," she said it quietly, without drama, "is something your models have no number for." The executor was silent for a long moment. A very long moment. "You have thought about this carefully," he said. "We have had a lot of practice," she said. "We've been here before. Not with your species. But the position, the impossible position, the fight we are supposed to lose, we know that place very well. We've visited it many times." She looked at him steadily. "We always leave it changed." Another silence. Somewhere in the old station, something creaked as the structure settled. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "I'm not proposing anything," she said. "I'm giving you a choice. You join the Covenant as a member species. Full membership. You release the occupied worlds. You face a difficult few decades of rebuilding trust, which will not be easy, and which you will not enjoy. In exchange, the war stops." She let that sit for a moment. "Or it continues. And in 40 years, when you expect to be watching us collapse, you get what that chart says instead." The executor looked at the chart one more time. He was a being, built for calculation, for probability, for the long view. His entire civilization had been built on the certainty that rational beings behaved in predictable ways, that a good enough model could account for anything. He was, Osei realized, not a cruel being. He was a certain one, and he had just been confronted with something he could not be certain about. "You would need guarantees," he said. "Our membership conditions, security arrangements." "Yes," she said. "Those conversations will be long and difficult, and there will be many people on my side who don't want them to happen at all." "And you? Do you want them to happen?" She thought about the 41 pages of names. She thought about Ishval, 9, still grinding away in the cold. She thought about the Bradbury, and the crew, and the explosion that had opened a gap in a flank that should never have been breachable. "I want the dying to stop," she said simply. "That's all. I want the dying to stop." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the chart one final time. Then he folded it precisely and set it aside. "We will need to consult our high command," he said. "Take the time you need," she said. "We'll be here." The talks that followed lasted 4 months. They were exactly as difficult as Osei had said they would be. Covenant member species argued furiously among themselves about what membership conditions were acceptable for a civilization that had invaded and destroyed 43 of their worlds. The Yvari nearly withdrew from the alliance entirely over points of principle. 3 separate agreements collapsed and had to be renegotiated from the beginning. But the shooting had stopped. Both sides had agreed to hold their positions while the talks continued. And once the shooting stopped, it was much harder to start again. In the end, the Dominion agreed. The occupied worlds were returned, slowly, over a period of years. The Vekthari entered the Covenant under the most restrictive membership conditions ever applied to any species, with oversight mechanisms that would take a generation to relax. It was not a clean ending. It was not a triumphant one. But it was an ending. The formal session to mark the close of the war was held on the same orbital station where, not so long ago, the Covenant had been preparing to surrender. The room was different now. It felt different. The red on the map was gone. Sareth found Osei after the speeches, in a quieter corner of the reception hall. He had aged since the first time she had walked into his war council. They both had. "I owe your species an apology," he said. "When you arrived at that first council, I thought you were too small, too fragile, too new." He paused. "I thought you were savages." Osei considered this for a moment. Outside the viewport behind him, a dozen new human colony ships were moving away from the station in a slow, steady procession, heading for the liberated worlds. They were not warships. They were carrying farmers and architects and doctors and engineers and children, all headed to places that needed to be put back together. "We were," she said. She said it without bitterness and without pride. It was just the truth. We spent a very long time being exactly that. We just had a few thousand years to figure out what to do with it. She looked at the colony ships a moment longer. Then she finished her coffee, set the cup down, and went to find her aide. There was a lot of work still to do. There always was. The war was over, but the worlds that had been burned needed rebuilding, and the species that had fought each other needed, slowly, carefully, to learn how to stop. That was not the work of soldiers. It was harder work than that. But humanity had done that before too. They were, it turned out, good at a great many things. The stars outside the viewport were cold and very old, and the ships moved through them steadily, carrying people toward the future. The war was already lost. Until it wasn't.